CapeTalk. Pippa's on Twitter.
You can tweet her at PJC Hudson.
Right, we are back into the world of non-fiction for Book Club today. And for the second week in a row, it's a local author whose book I just could not put down. This is the story of South Africa's, I think we can say, the most infamous murderess we've had, although we've had a couple of people giving her a run for her money in more recent years. But Daisy De Melker, a name most of us would have heard along the way at school. She was charged with killing her own son and possibly a few husbands as well along the way. But if you thought you knew the story, think again, because author Ted Botha has unearthed some really fascinating nuggets of info about not just Daisy herself, but all the cast of characters around her. And he has written it so well that although it's a work of non-fiction, it reads like a really fast-paced thriller. Ted, it's great to have you with us in studio today, and thanks for a riveting book. Lovely to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Sure. I mean, you didn't actually set out to write a book about Daisy De Melker, did you? She was a sort of a sidebar character in something else you were working on. What were you planning originally?
So I've always been fascinated by movies, and there's sort of very little known about the Hollywood that was created in Joburg back in the early 1900s.
Yeah.
At the same time that Hollywood was starting. And so I was researching Schlesinger, I.W. Schlesinger, who was starting this Hollywood. Mm-hmm. And I kind of found all these other interesting characters popping up, writers, politicians, and then, of course, the criminals, Johannesburg being Johannesburg, all these like criminals and very colorful criminals popped up. And of course, she was one of them. And so I decided to make her one of the characters in that book, mm-hmm. and kind of make it a ragtime Joburg type thing. And, then the criminal elements started running away with the story, and a whole bunch of criminals popped up who I just was fascinated by. And they kind of complemented Daisy's story.
Yeah. And you found all kinds of really interesting connections and threads weaving them together. I mean, Ted, that's what fascinated me. Is I started reading the book and I'm like, hang on a second, why am I reading the story of the Foster Gang? I thought this was a book about Daisy De Melker, but of course you got us there and brought in all these elements. There's the story of Herman Charles Bosman and his time in prison and all these other motley crew of criminals. I thought back to my history days at school, Ted, and learning about the gold rush and learning about the miners' strike in 22 and the landlords. There's sort of elements of the story that we know, but I hadn't really had a sense of the city, as you say, that colourful ragtime city of Joburg. And I mean, what you wrote in the afterword of the book, I thought really struck me. It's easy to forget that the city was trying to set itself up as one of the greatest metropolises in the world. And for a time, it almost did. There was no place like it on the continent. And in the league of criminals and con artists, it was up there with the most notorious cities in the world, with a signature all of its own. I mean, it really was the Wild West of Africa at one point, wasn't it?
No, of course. And, I've always loved Joburg. I mean, I was raised a little bit there and I worked there, and I've always had this passion for the place, despite all the people who decry it and say it's so awful. But, when I was I found the story that was set there, so that was fantastic, firstly. And then as all these people started coming up and the more things I dug up, I realized, hey, hold on a second. This is like Chicago.
Yeah.
I mean, there are all these amazing people who put anywhere else in the world would get their, they would get their own due. And yet here we're sitting with them in South Africa, and many of them have been forgotten. And so it was great to be able to just pull them all together. And as you said, that there was that kind of thread that ran through it. I mean, that was a total surprise that there was a connection, kind of sometimes tenuous, but it was there. And it was wonderful to imagine these people like wandering around the streets at the same time.
Now, of course, the court records in the history books will tell us that Daisy De Melker was hanged for the murder of her son Rhodes, and that she was suspected of killing 2 of her 3 husbands, but ultimately acquitted of those crimes. Ted, reading this book, there were so many other suspicious deaths around her. Mm-hmm. How many people do you think she might actually have killed along the way?
So I think I'm not the only one that people have said about 10. So that would have included her first 4 children. And then there were Rhodesian policemen at the time, or Southern Rhodesian policemen waiting to arrest her if she got off the trial in Johannesburg, which she didn't, to arrest her for her uncle, her initial fiancé who died, and somebody else they never specified.
Sure.
And they were all men, all of the male persuasion, and so she obviously did not like men.
But of course there was a monetary aspect to this. She was claiming on endowment policies and properties left to her in wills. I mean, What was it about her, do you think? Was it pure hatred of men married with pure greed, pure and simple? Or do you know, did she come from an unstable background that made her crave financial stability? What do you think was behind the motivation?
I think there are theories about her having been abused as a child. I mean, that is pure speculation.
Yep.
I mean, she was one of 11 children, poor family, shipped off to Rhodesia when she was a child to her father and her eldest brother. One doesn't know what happened there, but her lawyer, Harry Morris, who, as you know, figures very large in the book and is an incredibly colourful character, he thought that she was put onto this whole thing when her fiancé died when she was in about 2021, and she inherited some money off of him, and suddenly she kind of linked like money and death and kind of used that. But that doesn't explain why she would have killed infant children. I mean, she had nothing to gain from that, and why in the end she spared one of them, and that was the one who remained until he was 20 years old.
It's a fascinating tale. I mean, Ted, in terms of unearthing the detail, there's a lot in the history books about this case because the trial was such a media sensation and public sensation. A lot was written about it, and we'll talk about who was doing the writing in a moment. But you obviously had access to deeper sources and deeper research. Tell us a little bit about what you had to dive into to fully round out the character.
I mean, the thing is, there's a lot of misconception about Daisy and a lot of myth about her. The thing that came through to me was, and this is mostly from reading newspapers back at that time, I think those are the best record, and of course they had Pittman's shorthand, so you had journalists going into court and they were writing everything that was said. And then, of course, this was such a sensational trial. I mean, nothing had ever been seen like this before in South Africa. They printed everything virtually. So you'd have huge tracts in every day's newspaper for a month about this woman and her case. So this is fantastic. I mean, this was like a gold mine. And a lot of it hadn't been written about. Mm-hmm. So that for me was amazing. And then unfortunately, a lot of the stuff that comes out in books is some of the myth that's been repeated over time.
Yep.
So the original, the best journalist on the case was Benjamin Bennett, who was a crime reporter for the Argus newspapers. And he covered the trial, and he was always fascinated by her. And in his collections over the years, he always pulled her in. But even his story kind of changed a little bit over time. So you kind of have to try and tread a middle path about what he said, what she said, and then come out with what you think is the truth.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of questions that remain unanswered, even though there is a lot of stuff that comes out which has never been written about that I know of before.
Okay.
So it's and it's like interesting trying to find these tidbits because they're sometimes in very unusual places. But it was books and newspapers.
Okay. Just for those who come in late to the conversation, Ted Botha with us in studio, whose new book, Daisy De Melker Hiding Among Killers in the City of Gold, is just, I'm looking at the front cover and I see Lauren Bjerkes' shot, shiny, gutsy, gritty, and utterly electrifying. And that it is. It reads like a really tautly crafted, high-paced thriller that you take on holiday with you. Daisy De Melker, the trial, and her awareness of the coverage is what struck me, perhaps more than ever reading your book, Ted. A woman who was very alert to the role the media played in portraying her a certain way and wasn't above trying to influence that, and who was aware. I mean, I thought of her, if she'd been alive today, she would have been a social media influencer, maybe.
No, totally. I mean, I was thinking there was a book that Norman Mailer wrote in the 1980s, I think, The Executioner's Song, where he took the side of one of these prisoners who was up on death row. Yeah. And I almost felt as though Herman Charles Bosman and her became this kind of celebrity couple, even though she didn't know it, that Herman Charles Bosman was out there fighting for her cause. But she herself was very, very aware of coming out of court, seeing people, knowing that they were there for her, worrying about her appearance in the media and what people said about her. And the thing you might have thought it when you're reading it, but I found her a very, very strong woman. She, even though people don't exactly say that. I mean, her lawyer said if she had been a man, she would have been a general in the army. But she just comes across as this very in control, strong, likable among women. She had women friends. She liked women. And that was what struck me a lot about her. Was this wasn't a woman who just like murdered people and then sat between her tail now that she'd been found out. She was very methodical about it. She did it over 20 years, and when she was, when she was found out, she kind of sat up in court and she took notes and she kind of was there.
Yeah, really showed up. Now, you've referenced Herman Charles Bosman. You'll have to read the book to fully understand the dots that get connected between, of course, that famous writer, and I think most people will at some stage have recalled the fact that he himself spent time in prison for killing a relative, but he became a great anti-death penalty activist after his own release from jail, and that was part of the reason he was taken with her case dead, because he knew that were she to be convicted, she would face the noose, as she did, and went to the gallows. Now, before you came in, our listener Anton wrote in to say, I grew up with the song Daisy, Daisy, You're Half Crazy, being told that it was linked to Daisy De Melker. Is that true or false? You do reference this in the book a little bit.
No, I mean, it was just the ditty that was taken at the time. And I mean, I think, her name Daisy actually helped a lot in the sensationalism of the trial, because here was a daisy, a flower, beautiful, blossomy, but she was being had up for the most vile of murders. And I mean, poison was regarded as the most vile way of killing somebody. And, so I guess the temptation was just too great to make a ditty out of her.
So that's what you might have heard, Anton. The original song, of course, predates the trial by many years, but the Daisy ditty, as it was around the trial, might be what you were referencing growing up. Okay, so, I mean, we've spoken about the trial being such a sensation and the huge tracts and tracts of newspaper coverage, but it wasn't just the press who were fascinated. Ted, I mean, your stories of people camping out on the steps of the courtroom waiting to try and get a seat the next day fascinated me. I mean, it was a level of sort of whipping up of public emotion around the trial. Was it the first time that had happened, or had they seen that before in Joburg?
I mean, as far as the newspaper cuttings go, the different characters that I cover, like Andrew Gibson and the Foster Gang, and I think the Foster Gang in 1914, if people don't remember, this band of thugs that kind of went on the rampage for a few months in Joburg and ripped the city into this hysteria. It was the first kind of real media frenzy. But it was very, very quick, short, But Daisy, she kind of started with a preliminary trial in April, and then it kind of lasted until, she was hung in December. So it was quite a long, drawn-out thing. And I think trials were very much theatre. Hey? They were the entertainment of the day, and there was a lot happening in entertainment at the time. It was the changeover of movies from silence into talkies, and as her lawyer said, trials were theatre for people. I mean, they could come in and they could see like people really sobbing and stamping on tables
Drama.
and crying and fainting, and it was the real thing, die echte ding, as they say in Afrikaans. And I think especially a woman who came, and they were always, every story I read, it was always, there were a lot of women in the court. And it was a source of entertainment. So, of course, there was a lot of curiosity, and I think a lot of hatred towards Daisy especially, So, the fact that she'd been married 3 times, and as Bosman said, a lot of these women had never even had one husband, and here she'd had 3, and she'd killed them, or killed 2 of them. So it was that as well. So it was a kind of combination. It was like a perfect storm.
Yeah, all coming together at the same time. Now, in terms of the public spectacle, Alistair asking, would this have been a public execution or a private one?
Oh no, definitely private.
Yeah.
So it was interesting. So I got details of what the gallows looked like from something that was written at the time that Bosman was in Pretoria Central, and they said that it had actually come from a cleaner, because he was the only person that was allowed into the gallows besides the people who attended, which were the head of the prison, the head of the prison service, the bishop. The bishop was also the Anglican bishop, was there for Daisy. So it was only a couple of people that were allowed in. So I mean, the fact that you actually know, and it's described in the book, what the gallows looked like, I mean, I found it really eerie.
Where was she buried, Ted? I know you covered in the book, but for the sake of the listeners who would want to know.
She was buried in an unmarked grave in Pretoria.
Okay.
So people will actually find a mistake in the book, because I relied on Benjamin Bennett and a couple of other sources who said she was buried in the Brixton Cemetery.
Yeah.
And she wasn't. So I actually found out afterwards she was buried in an unmarked grave in Pretoria West.
Okay, so for those who are going to make a crusade to the Brixton Cemetery to try and find her, you'll be looking a long time because she's not actually there.
Yeah, and you might not have any success in Pretoria West either because it was an unmarked grave.
Okay, so one of those that remains hidden away, and probably just as well. Look, Ted, as I said at the start, I think you've done such a great job in spinning the yarn. It reads like a work of fiction, and she's such a character. You if you did not know this was a true story and one of our own true stories, you might think this was the script of the next Hollywood blockbuster. Final question is, as far as you know, has anybody ever tried to turn her story into something? I know there was a very dodgy TV miniseries many years ago, but has anybody ever sort of portrayed all of this and that time and that nugget of that moment in time in Joburg on screen?
No, there hasn't. But I mean, this is the first time the story has been weaved together in such a way where you bring in Foster and Andrew Gibson and the Irene Cantac murder and Dorothea Kraft, who we haven't mentioned, but another murderess who was in at the time.
And even Arthur Conan Doyle even makes an appearance.
Yeah, Arthur Conan Doyle. So, I think that was what I mean. For me, it reads very filmically.
Yeah.
In that there are these episodes of people coming in and out of Daisy's story, and I mean, there have been people asking about filming it, but who knows? I think the obvious person, of course, I can think of there is an obvious person to play Daisy, but...
and who's that for you?
Who would you think?
Everyone I'm thinking of is too beautiful to play Daisy De Melker.
Well, who played Monster?
Oh my gosh, Miss Charlize Theron. There we go. Why not?
Yeah.
Now you've planted a seed.
Yeah.
Let's put it out there into the universe and see if it'll manifest. Ted, it's been a delight having you with us in studio, and thank you for a brilliant read. It is out now, published by Jonathan Ball. It's called Daisy De Melker Hiding Among Killers in the City of Gold, and you'll find it in stores at around about 290 Rand in paperback. Ted Botha, great to have you with us.
Thanks, Pippa.